For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Claire Bissika discusses her book titled On the Brink, South Africa's Political and Fiscal Cliffhanger. In the foreword of your book, Judge Dennis Davis reflects that our country's finances were well managed for years by people like Minister Trevor Manuel, but nonetheless, millions of people have been left behind and have not been true economic citizens. Do you have an explanation for this problem?
So you can distinguish between the public finances and the performance of the economy. So the public finances were very well managed. Under Trevor Manuel, right up to the brink of the global financial crisis, we were running surpluses. We had a period of incredibly good growth, a golden patch. From 2005 to 2009, the economy grew at about 5.5% every year. And we created 1.2 million jobs. It was the longest economic upswing in history. It lasted 99 months. And it was the biggest private and fixed investment upswing in the country's history as well. So we had a wonderful period of growth. It was partly as a result of the commodity super cycle. So China was growing and it was sucking in raw materials. So you had this wonderful boost to the economy. Unfortunately, the policymakers at the time patted themselves on the back a bit too early, and they thought a lot of the growth was homegrown, and it was a result of having got on top of our structural problems. And so they let expenditure run a little bit. They let the reins loose, and they employed 250,000 more civil servants, and they paid them well over the odds. So for the last 10 years, they've had increases hugely above inflation every year. Not just the wage increase, but the bill. So in terms of headcount growing and salary increase, we've had a real explosion over the period after the global financial crisis in our public wage bill. We've also had an explosion of spending on goods and services. So our fiscal problems come down to too much spending on an inefficient and unproductive government at a time when growth has been slowing. So the whole period after the global financial crisis, growth initially bounced back quite nicely into 2011, 3.6% growth. But every single year after 2011, growth has slowed. And it's like a private household. If you have overestimated your salary for 5 years in a row, which the Treasury did with growth. So every year for the last 5 years, it has said growth will be higher than it finally turned out to be. And it based its revenue collection forecast on what it thinks the growth rate will be. So if it's underestimating growth, revenue is coming in short every single year. And like a private household, if you don't cut your spending accordingly, you run up debt. And our debt has doubled in 8 years. So under Manuel, it was halved in 13 years. After the global financial crisis, our debt to GDP ratio doubled in 10 years. So from having been the best in our peer group in terms of our debt dynamics, we're now among the worst in our peer group. And it's happened mostly because growth has slowed. And that is partly because the whole commodity super cycle turned, partly because we had the global financial crisis. We did like other countries did. We introduced a big, powerful fiscal stimulus, which meant we threw money at the problem. But we spent it on the wrong things. A lot of it went on wages and a lot of it went on goods and services. So that's the fiscal story in a nutshell. And it's a very interesting story. It's about how we really have backed ourselves into a corner in terms of our public finances. The economic story about leaving people behind is about not implementing a growth policy. So we've talked about policy. Between 2009 and 2012, we implemented 3 growth policies, 3 different growth policies in 3 years, IPAP, the New Growth Path, and the National Development Plan. And we never implemented any of them. We said we were, we lied, we didn't. And we now sit with unemployment at a record high, 27.7%, inequality growing, poverty growing, unemployment high and still growing. And we blame the National Treasury for not spending enough money, for standing in the way of transformation, when in fact we don't even implement our own growth policy. And that's the sort of issues that the book tries to explain and really understand how come we've underperformed so poorly.
Business confidence looms large through your book. What is business confidence and why do you think it's so important?
That's a very good question, and I'm so interested that you picked up on that, because at the moment that is actually our number one problem, is that confidence has evaporated. Business confidence is now as low as it was during the global financial crisis, and the political constraint indicator, which is a question is asked to business, is the political climate a constraint on your doing business? And 80% of business people say yes, and that is as high as it was in 1993. So that is a reflection of how business feels. So confidence is a sentiment indicator. It's whether you feel able to invest. Do you feel confident enough about the future to expand your business? A lot of investment has been constrained by the lack of demand. So it's not happening because business is not confident, it's because there is no demand for their product. So if you've got spare capacity, why would you invest in more capacity if you already got spare capacity standing idle? So that's part of the answer. The other part is this lack of confidence in the political future of the country. And because it's such a sort of catchphrase, people aren't investing because they lack confidence, or business is not investing because of policy uncertainty. You hear those kind of statements thrown around a lot. I was really keen to test it empirically. Could we prove that businesses aren't investing because of policy uncertainty? Can you draw that link? And so the book tries to go into these things in quite a lot of depth. And I have a graph showing, I call it the jaws of the crocodile. And the top jaw of the crocodile is the amount of cash building up on corporate balance sheets, which means they're not investing it, they're sitting on it. That's the cash pile that we hear about, the investment strike. So that is this amount of money climbing up to about R1 trillion that could be invested, but isn't, because businesses adopted a wait-and-see attitude. The bottom graph, the bottom jaw of the crocodile, the one that slopes downwards, is the SACI business confidence indicator. So it shows that there is a direct inverse correlation between the cash pile growing and business confidence falling. So you can graph it. Business is not investing because when times are particularly uncertain, there's more value to be had in adopting a wait-and-see attitude. So it is explained in the book, and in fact I go into about another 2 or 3 different ways, in addition to the graph, of trying to rationalize it in an empirical way. So it's not just an opinion of people. It's compelling when you look at the evidence.
You quote economist Ricardo Husman as warning that under our President Jacob Zuma, our country is in danger of making a historic mistake. What did he mean by this warning? He means we're in danger of tacking left to populist policies and thinking we can find the solutions in quick fixes, knee-jerk responses, and policies that will frighten away investment and business. So that we are on the brink, really, of making that mistake, of taking a path downwards that it really entrenches the status quo. And if the ANC decides in December to vote for a status quo candidate, a pro-Zuma candidate, someone from that faction, we will perpetuate the status quo, which means we will continue on this downward path towards more populist solutions, more knee-jerk asset-grabbing, land-grabbing solutions that are more elite enrichment. It frightens away investment, it frightens business, it results in lower growth. So that is the historic mistake that we were on the brink of, and the book is called On the Brink. We're on the brink of making a political mistake, and we're on the brink of making a fiscal mistake. We stand on the fiscal cliff as well, because our fiscal situation has now got to the point where we really cannot afford any longer period of low growth. Growth has got to recover for our fiscal maths to add up. We're now in a situation where the IMF reckons in 5 years we will be in debt distress if growth stays at 1%. So this is the danger that we sit on. We really sit on a knife edge now. We mustn't underestimate how dangerous the situation is. You also write about the Nene Gate saga as an example of state capture. Former Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene told you that he was fired for being an obstacle or an irritant to our president. Tell us more about this. So Nhlanhla Nene is a real straight arrow. He doesn't seem to bear any bitterness or anger about being fired.
He doesn't blame Jacob Zuma. He doesn't say he drew the line on nuclear or on SAA, which is the common cause in the media. That's the information that's trotted out every time. He was an obstacle on these things. He says he wasn't an obstacle on anything specific and anything that was related to Jacob Zuma in particular. He says the Treasury drew the line on everything. It drew the line on overspending on every single thing that it could because it had to. And in that way, it didn't make any friends. The whole of Cabinet was finding that they had projects delayed, projects that they couldn't do. And so Treasury, unless the head of Treasury has the support of the President, it's an extremely lonely position. You cannot actually do the job unless you have the backing of the President. And that is a position that Nene found himself in, and of Gordon even more so. And it was because Treasury was drawing the line and saying we have to start cutting our suit according to our cloth. We have to start trimming the frills, and that didn't sit well with his colleagues.
Can you describe the evolution of post-apartheid South Africa's fiscal position? Do you regard the country as facing a fiscal cliff, or do you think that, like the US, our country should set a debt ceiling for itself?
Sure. So the term fiscal cliff, it's quite an imprecise one. There is no definition of what constitutes a fiscal cliff. And it's an American term that is a popular term that they use in the States to describe their debt ceiling. If we hit the debt ceiling, we go over the debt ceiling, then we've gone over the fiscal cliff. So we don't have a debt ceiling in this country. We have an expenditure ceiling, which is it's a purely self-imposed ceiling that is set up by the Treasury in order to safeguard our long-term fiscal sustainability. So they're saying we won't spend more than this amount because if we do, it's going to be unaffordable in the long run. So my definition of fiscal cliff in the book is not breaching the expenditure ceiling. That would just be something that could happen this year, and the following year you could be under the ceiling. That wouldn't be a fiscal cliff event. Fiscal cliff, and the way I use it, is really the situation that we could end up in where we were in debt distress, where we had to turn to the IMF for a bailout or a default if we defaulted on our debts. So we're a very long way away from that. The IMF has said if growth stays at 1% or if our state and enterprise sector calls in all its government guarantees. The moment the government guarantees are at 500 billion, if they call them all in, that could put us into debt distress in 5 years. So that is the situation. I firmly believe we will go over the fiscal cliff if we do not change tack decisively. If we do not get a government in that is able to raise the growth rate and increase the labour absorption of the economy, we will go over the fiscal cliff. And it could happen as early as next year if our ratings are junked by all rating agencies and all our ratings. So our local currency ratings get junked. If we elect the wrong person in December, huge loss of confidence, rand crisis, recession, it could compound very quickly. So we're in a really dangerous situation now in terms of the choices we make in the next few months.
You argue that government's National Development Plan has not been implemented. Why is this the case, and what do you think should be done to get the NDP back on track?
So the NDP, in getting it implemented, is entirely due to political will. If the political will was there, it would have been implemented. And getting it implemented amounts to, requires the same thing. It requires strong leadership, but it also requires a capable bureaucracy, a state that can implement it. And the state, as we know, has been hollowed out through state capture and through sheer inefficiency and incompetence. We have put people into cabinet posts who are incompetent hacks, insufferable incompetent hacks who should never have been given the jobs. And now they sit unable to carry out their portfolios. We've allowed bad policies to be put in place that have allowed our mining sector to just shrivel up, no investment happening. Economists like to say that bad policies consistently applied are better than good policies inconsistently applied. And the mining sector says, well, we're an example of bad policies inconsistently applied, the worst of all worlds. So there's a litany of reasons for why we're in the state we're in. And the real reason the NDP wasn't implemented was The political trade-offs were too tough to make. The political capital and the political will just wasn't there to do them. And to have them and to land the NDP now across the whole of society, you need incredibly strong leadership. You need a cohesive national will and national vision that unites behind the NDP to land it across society as a whole. And I argue in the book that it could be done, that the NDP is not stone dead. It's a very unfashionable position to take, because the NDP is stone dead in the sense that it's been allowed to die, but it could be dusted off, it could be rebranded, you could build energy around it and behind it, and we have to do it because we don't have time to develop a new economic plan. And the third one, we've had 3 in 3 years, now we've got an emergency. We don't have time to spend a couple of years wandering around achieving consensus on the economy. We have got to move and raise the growth rate as fast as we can.
You interviewed a number of important economists in researching your book. Can you tell us about what was said in some of these interviews?
Well, they've spread throughout the book. The book is peppered with quotes and direct responses from a range of economists, and I think the central view that comes across is that the future of the economy is binary. In other words, we're either going to have a good outcome or we're going to have a bad outcome. We cannot have a muddling through scenario, because we've been muddling through now for about the last 5 years, and growth has been slowing in each one of those years. And if your economy grows at less than 2%, you're not creating jobs meaningfully. And with population growth of about 1.7%, if you're not growing above that, people are getting poorer. And that means that your social instability will rise and your fiscal problems will rise. So if we trundle along at 1%, we get to distress in 5 years, according to the IMF. So muddling through is not an option. And unfortunately, muddling through is the consensus economic forecast for South Africa. Most economists believe that we will muddle through at 1 to 2% growth for the next 3 to 5 years. That's the consensus. There are far worse scenarios on the table. But the future for the economy has got to be either good or bad, because if you muddle through and you're not growing strongly at above 2, you're going backwards. So that's, I think, the broad consensus on the economy. A good outcome is one where the government completely and decisively deals with corruption and embraces the private sector as a partnership, goes into partnership with the private sector and focuses on creating more firms, more taxpayers, more tax revenue, building the economy, faster growth, more jobs. The bad outcome is what we're sitting with right now. Recession, multiple downgrades, rising debt, this negative spiral of insustainability, and it just leads you further and further towards a kleptocratic state. And after many years, you become Venezuela, and we're further down that road than I would like us to be right now.
You also argue that manufacturing and mining, they have a key role to play in our country's economic development. How could these sectors be better supported?
Right, so the mining sector, I spoke about regulation. I said we've got the worst of all worlds. We've got bad policy, inconsistently applied, and that is the story of mining. That really is the bottom line in mining. Sure, the mines themselves have got to come to the party in a very big way in terms of employee benefits and housing and the sustainability of the communities in which they operate, environmental factors, acid mine drainage, health, sustainability. The mines have tried to come to the table, and I think they are working on a lot of programs in their communities, and that's an important step for them. But the policy side has got to be sorted out, and I'm interested that the Chamber of Mines has finally been more strategic in its approach. It's decided it can't work with the minister. It's going to write its own charter with business and labour and the communities, and that is exactly the sort of thing that we want to see from business. On manufacturing, the story there is one of very tough global conditions. It's obviously a big part of it, and of course for mining, the commodity cycle has been very, very tough for the mining sector. But for manufacturing, they've really battled since the global financial crisis, and they've battled a lot more than other emerging markets. So then you've got to look at the homegrown factors. If the other emerging market economies are exporting 10 times more than we are, then the problems are here at home. And that chapter unpacks all of those toxic factors that combined have made it so hard for manufacturing to do well. And it comes down to the binding constraints on growth that were identified by SCISA 10 years ago. The same thing, shortage of high-skilled labor, big factor, the logistics system that is inefficient, high cost of port rail, high cost of broadband, labor, which until recently was striking 12 million work days a year. You know, it was a very difficult and fraught labor environment after the global financial crisis for many years. You can go through the factors: high input costs, municipalities that are unable to deliver basic services, smelters that burn up because the water shedding is happening. So that chapter deals with all the structural factors that as a country we have never got on top of. And after many years, you find that your manufacturing sector has stopped investing. They just can't do it anymore. And that's the tipping point where a lot of firms find themselves. Either there's got to be some changes or you pack up and go home. And that's where we are right now.
You also argue that the youth wage subsidy was a success, but it didn't have very large impact on youth unemployment. Can you reflect on what strategies you think would best assist in bringing young people into the labor market?
Sure. So the youth wage subsidy created about 600,000 jobs in 2 years. So it was a resounding success. But during that same period, the number of young people entering the labor market was even greater. So your overall youth unemployment still rose, even though you had a successful intervention. So the lesson there is the youth wage subsidy is what you have to do when your economy is not creating jobs. The solution, of course, is to have the economy creating jobs. It's evidence of the dysfunction. I like the Harambee model. I'm sure a lot of people know about Harambee and what it's done. It's a job matching service. So it matches supply and demand for jobs by putting first-time entrants, young people, into jobs who otherwise would have been missed by the recruitment networks. So these are people who didn't have matric, who are really at the bottom of the pile in terms of getting jobs. And it runs these work readiness programs for big corporates that identify all the risks that the corporate is worried about in terms of recruiting young, unproven people without the necessary qualifications. And it works on those things for a good long period in the run-up to the people being employed. And those Harambee recruits, when you measure their performance on measurable benchmarks, so in a call center you can work out how many calls were dropped and all, you know, there are actual empirical benchmarks that you can measure them on. They actually do better than some of the, on average, than the recruits that have recruited in the normal way through the normal recruitment networks who have the necessary qualifications, because a lot of it comes down to your attitude in the workplace. That Harambee model should be scaled up on a massive scale throughout the economy. And the government shouldn't be doing it. It should be subsidizing the recruitment industry to run workplace programs and job matching. That is going to make a big difference. Harambee's reached 40,000 kids in 5 years, kids who would otherwise have never got employment. So, you know, that's just one clever, innovative solution that's been developed by the NGO sector. There's a lot happening in the youth employment space. It's a big area, but the youth wage subsidy is a proven method. We know it works. The national minimum wage is going to have the complete opposite effect. It raises entry wages. So I would carve out the national minimum wage. I would make a carve out for young first-time entrants. To support the whole problem of youth unemployment.
So you've touched on what I was going to ask, the national minimum wage.
Yeah.
But do you really think it will have a positive impact?
It'll have a very positive impact if you're the person getting the highest salary. So for about 4 million people, you will get 1,000 Rand more a month. That's a big benefit if you're earning 2,000 Rand a month. So for people who stand to gain, and that's in total about 6.7 million people, I think. It's about 47% of the workforce will get a salary increase. That's half the structure of the workforce is going to get a salary increase. So it's a big benefit for those who benefit. And within a firm, it will narrow the gap between the top earners and the lower earners. It narrows that wage gap within a firm, and that could be good for productivity, it could be good for trust, it could be good for the firm. But for the country as a whole, it widens the gap between the people who are unemployed, because for them to get an entry wage, an entry-level job, it's now become harder because the wage is higher. So for the people outside the tent, it's a disaster. For the unemployed, they've been sold down the river. That is the problem. In a country where youth unemployment is your biggest problem, do you raise the hurdle to employing young people in their first jobs? You should be lowering it. And that's what the youth wage subsidy does. So the two policies are completely in conflict. And the youth wage subsidy comes to an end at a time where the national minimum wage kicks in. And that's going to be, if the national minimum wage is delayed as long as I think it will be delayed, into 2019, an election year. You're not going to have the government pull the national minimum wage off the table in an election year. So you're potentially going to have a youth unemployment meltdown in 2019 because of the national minimum wage taking effect. It could have a very negative impact on small labour-intensive businesses, which are precisely the type of businesses this economy needs.
You quote economist Nazmira Mola as saying, "If we sort our leadership, all else will follow." Do you support this sentiment?
I 100% support it. It's one of the conclusions of the book, really, that authentic, honest leadership is in fact the solution for the country. We can't restore confidence without it. South Africans need a vision. They need a future to buy into, and without it, we just keep going around in circles. And I don't know if we're going to see it. I mean, there's a lot riding on the December ANC conference. If we don't get the leadership change that can inspire the country and restore confidence, growth will continue to contract, and our economy will continue to descend.
Just for interest's sake, what are you hoping to see maybe after the December conference?
Well, if we see an anti-Zuma faction win, I believe that business would rally round the new candidate very quickly. You would see a gain in the rand, you would see confidence return. The new candidate is going to have their work cut out for them. They're inheriting a real mess. And the population is becoming very impatient. So the temptation to resort to popular solutions and social spending is going to be very hard to resist for that candidate. Whoever it is, it might be Cyril, it might be somebody else. I'm hoping to see anybody that isn't from the Zuma faction, because if it is, whoever is from the Zuma faction, you will see a continuation of the status quo, of those patronage networks that would just continue to feed. And that has to stop in order for us to change tack and go for growth. If there is a Zuma faction person, they might pretend to have ripped out those patronage networks, but if they are backed by the people, the very people themselves who rely on those networks, nothing will change. And that is the danger that we face.
That was Claire Bissika speaking to Crima Media's Polity about her book titled On the Brink, South Africa's Political and Fiscal Cliffhanger.